He was once the most powerful man in Europe, a towering king who strode through his court with unmatched confidence, dazzling in his youth with strength, charm, and ambition. Henry VIII was not just a monarch, he was a force of nature, feared by his enemies and adored by his people. But behind the glitter of his crown and the grandeur of his palaces, time was quietly plotting its revenge. In his final years, the same king who had commanded armies and reshaped the church became a broken man, consumed by disease, pain, and paranoia. His decline was so grotesque that whispers filled the halls. Was this truly the natural end of a mighty ruler, or had something darker claimed him? Today we peel back the centuries of secrecy to uncover the shocking medical truth behind Henry VIII's death. A truth buried deep in history. If you want to know the hidden story of how one of England's most notorious kings really met his end, stay with us. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold histories. When Henry VIII first took the throne in 1509, England believed it had found not just a king, but a hero. He was only 17, tall and broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart. Courtiers and foreign ambassadors described him as the very picture of majesty, golden-haired, athletic, and brimming with energy. He rode horses with unmatched skill, jousted fearlessly in the lists, and could spend hours hunting in the forests without showing fatigue. To his people, Henry was the embodiment of strength and vitality, a living symbol of England's rising power. But Henry wasn't admired only for his body. He was brilliant too. He spoke several languages, wrote poetry, and even composed music that would echo through the halls of his court. Unlike many kings who ruled through intimidation alone, Henry combined charm with authority. He could disarm an ally with his wit, or terrify an enemy with a single glance. To his courtiers, standing in his presence was like standing before the sun itself, dazzling, blinding, and unforgettable. Foreign rulers noticed as well. Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire all treated the young king with caution and respect. Here was not a weak boy in need of guidance, but a formidable monarch who seemed destined to leave his mark on history. At home, the people celebrated him. They saw him as a warrior king, a protector of England's honor, and even God's chosen ruler. In those early years, no one could imagine that this radiant figure and this powerful, magnetic man would one day collapse into sickness, obesity, and despair. The contrast between the king Henry was and the man he became is what makes his final story so shocking. For how could someone so strong fall so far? The Henry VIII, who once dazzled Europe with his youth and vigor, did not last. By his late 30s, the cracks in his once mighty frame began to show, and what followed was a slow and painful descent that transformed him from a striking monarch into a figure of misery. The turning point came in 1536 during a jousting tournament. Henry, who had once dominated the lists, was thrown violently from his horse. The fall left him unconscious for hours, and though he eventually recovered, the damage to his leg never truly healed. An open wound festered into a chronic ulcer that refused to close, oozing and rotting despite the desperate treatments of his doctors. The smell alone was said to fill a room before the king even entered. As the years dragged on, the injury worsened, robbing him of the ability to ride and to hunt as he once had. Stripped of the activities that had defined his youth, Henry's body began to change. He grew heavier, his waist expanding to nearly 55 inches, his once powerful stride reduced to a painful shuffle. What had been the physique of a warrior king turned into the swollen, lumbering frame of a man imprisoned by his own body. With every passing year, the ulcers grew more agonizing, and he lashed out at courtiers and servants in fits of temper that were as frightening as his physical decline. Gone was the golden-haired athlete admired across Europe. In his place stood a king, bloated, diseased and tormented, trapped in a body that betrayed him at every step. The proud monarch who once embodied vitality was now a prisoner of pain, humiliation, and decay. It was a transformation so grotesque that those who had known Henry in his prime could barely recognize him. The king who had once seemed unstoppable was now crumbling from within. As Henry's health collapsed, his physicians were thrust into a battle they could never win. Medicine in the 16th century was less science and more guesswork, bound by superstition and theories that today seem almost cruel. The king's doctors believed that illness came from an imbalance of the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Their solution was to restore balance, no matter how painful or ineffective the treatment. For Henry, this meant endless rounds of bloodletting, where leeches were placed on his skin or veins were opened to drain the sickness. Instead of healing him, these methods only left him weaker, pale and more vulnerable to infection. His ulcerated legs became the greatest source of his suffering. Doctors tried poultices of herbs, oils and strange concoctions meant to draw out the poison. They smeared his wounds with honey, vinegar and even mixtures of animal fat, hoping for a miracle that never came. Bandages had to be changed daily, each removal tearing away flesh and leaving him screaming in pain. At times, his sores were cauterized with hot irons in desperate attempts to close them, but the wounds always reopened, raw and festering. Nothing seemed to bring relief. His obesity made the ulcers worse, yet no physician dared to tell the king to change his diet of heavy meats, pastries and ale. Instead, they continued their rituals, bleeding him, purging him with harsh laxatives, and prescribing tonics of ground pearls, crushed gemstones, and exotic herbs imported from across Europe. These remedies cost a fortune, but offered little more than false hope. Behind the palace doors, Henry VIII's physicians lived in constant fear. To fail the king was dangerous, yet their knowledge was too limited to save him. They stood helpless as the once mighty monarch rotted slowly before their eyes, their treatments doing little more than prolonging his agony. It was a struggle that revealed not only the weakness of medieval medicine, but also the tragedy of a ruler who could command armies, yet not command his own health. By the winter of 1546, the great Henry VIII was a shadow of the man who had once terrified Europe. Confined to his chambers at Whitehall Palace, he lived in constant agony. His leg ulcers oozed endlessly, the stench clinging to the air no matter how many herbs were burned to mask it. He was so swollen that he had to be carried from bed to chair with a system of pulleys, his once proud stride reduced to the shuffle of servants dragging him from place to place. Nights were the worst. The pain kept him awake, and when he did sleep, he was tormented by fevered dreams of the enemies he had executed, Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and countless others, all haunting him in the silence of the dark. But it was not just his body that betrayed him. His mind, too, began to unravel. Paranoia consumed him. He suspected treachery everywhere, even from those closest to him. Courtiers walked on eggshells, terrified that a glance, a word or a whisper might send them to the tower. The once charismatic king had become a man trapped in suspicion and fear. Even priests who came to comfort him could not ease his torment, for Henry refused to confess his sins. Perhaps pride held him back, or perhaps the weight of his crimes was too great to face. Whatever the reason, he chose silence, leaving his soul as troubled as his body. In those final days, the atmosphere inside the palace grew heavy and eerie. Servants whispered in corridors, avoiding eye contact, as if the very walls held the king's rage and despair. The great monarch who had reshaped England, who had broken with Rome and declared himself head of the church, now lay rotting in his bed, powerless and afraid. When death finally came in January 1547, it was not the glorious end of a mighty ruler, but the pitiful passing of a man crushed by his own body and haunted by his own deeds. It was a death as tragic as it was inevitable. Centuries after Henry VIII's death, the mystery of what truly killed him continues to haunt historians and doctors alike. His symptoms were so severe and varied that they defy a simple explanation. Some believe he suffered from untreated type 2 diabetes, a condition that would explain his extreme obesity, constant thirst, mood swings, and the slow-healing ulcers that ravaged his legs. Others argue it was kidney disease, worsened by years of rich food, heavy drinking, and the crude medicines forced upon him. The swelling of his body and the unbearable pain in his lower limbs point clearly toward renal failure, a silent killer in an age with no cure. Heart failure is another likely culprit. By the end of his life, Henry's weight was estimated at over 300 pounds, and combined with his sedentary lifestyle, this would have placed immense strain on his heart. His shortness of breath, lethargy, and sudden fits of weakness all suggest cardiovascular collapse. But some theories wander into even darker territory. For years, whispers of syphilis followed his name. Although no records prove he had the disease, his mood swings, paranoia, and physical decay mirror its late-stage effects. Others claim he may have suffered from a rare genetic disorder, such as McLeod syndrome, which causes muscle weakness, mental instability, and the very symptoms described in Henry's final years. And then there is the question no one in Tudor England dared speak aloud. Was Henry poisoned? His court was a nest of intrigue, and his ruthless treatment of allies and enemies alike created countless people who might have wanted revenge. Slow poisoning could account for his lingering decline, though there is no concrete proof. What is certain, however, is that Henry's death was not a simple case of old age. It was the product of disease, neglect, and centuries of medical ignorance. Modern experts still debate the exact cause, but one truth remains clear. The most powerful king in England's history was brought down not by a sword or an assassin, but by his own failing body. Modern research has peeled back the layers of rumor and speculation to uncover a truth more shocking than any legend. While theories of syphilis and poisoning make for dramatic tales, the latest medical evidence suggests Henry VIII's death was most likely caused by a combination of untreated type 2 diabetes, obesity-related heart failure, and chronic infections from his leg ulcers. His festering wounds would have left him vulnerable to sepsis, a blood infection that in the 16th century was a slow but certain death sentence, coupled with kidney failure, which explains his swelling and constant fatigue. Henry's body was essentially shutting down on multiple fronts. In today's world, with antibiotics, insulin, and modern surgery, he might have lived much longer. In Tudor England, however, his fate was sealed. But why was the truth hidden for so long? In Henry's time, a king's body was not just flesh and blood. It was a symbol of divine authority. To admit that God's chosen ruler had died in filth and disease would have shattered the image of power the Tudors so carefully built. Chronic ulcers, obesity, and gluttony were not the marks of a divinely favored monarch, but of weakness and corruption. So the court spun the story. Chroniclers described his passing with dignity, emphasizing his courage and strength rather than the gruesome reality of his decline. The truth was buried alongside him, sealed in silence by those who feared tarnishing the royal legacy. For centuries, historians repeated the sanitized version, until modern medicine gave us the tools to look again. Today we see Henry not as the untouchable giant he wanted the world to believe, but as a man undone by his own appetites, his injuries, and the limits of his age. The shocking truth is that the king who ruled with iron will was felled not by enemies, but by preventable diseases, and the shame of it was so great, his court ensured the real story remained hidden for generations. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden truth behind Henry VIII's final days, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. And so, the great Henry VIII, the king who defied the Pope, reshaped England, and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, was not defeated on the battlefield or at the hands of an assassin. He was undone by his own body, betrayed by wounds that would not heal, and by a medical world too primitive to save him. It is a cruel irony. The man who commanded armies and altered history could not escape the slow, merciless grip of disease. His story is a reminder that even the most powerful are still human, and that time and mortality spare no king.